saints, they're real saints. Struggling with life's problems and life's pressures. As we come into Psalm 42 and Psalm 43, we find a man lamenting. Look at verse 3 of Psalm 42. My tears have been my food day and night. You know what he's saying there? I've lost my appetite and I cry out loud. Just can't keep a lid on it. Day and night, tears are his food. It's a poetic way of saying that he is copiously crying. He's lost his appetite, and that's accompanied with a downcast soul. Psalm 42 verse 1, as the deer pants for the water brooks, so my soul pants for you, O God. Like an animal fatigued in its desperate search for water, this man is physically drained and without strength. Look at verse 7. Deep calls upon deep at the noise of your waterfalls, as all your waves and billows have gone over me. By the way, he's acknowledging that under the sovereignty of God, God has allowed this. God has allowed this. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. And there's the absence of the desirable and there's the presence of the difficult. He recognizes God is in it, but he's acknowledging he kind of feels like he's drowning. Don't you like the realism? It's the Psalms. I love the Psalms. Not robo-saints here, real saints. And finally, there's a sense of rejection. We read this in verse 9 of Psalm 42. I will say to the God of my rock, why have you forgotten me? Why do I go mourning because of the oppression of the enemy? That's repeated again in verse 2 of Psalm 43. For you are the God of my strength. Why do you cast me off? Why do I go mourning? And this is just a phenomenal picture of a lonely mourner. Just that feeling that overwhelms him, rejected by man, forgotten by God. How does he fight and send to flight depression? There's a number of things here. First thing I see is a present examination. The first step on the road to recovery for a man or woman who's feeling depressed or stressed is you've got to take yourself in hand. In fact, the psalmist begins to get a hold of himself. Here he is, falling. But he realizes at some point here, I've got to stop this fall. I got to keep my nose up. And he helps himself by asking a series of questions. He does not indulge in the luxury of self-pity. Rather, he sits himself down and he proceeds to cross-examine his emotions. Look at the structure, the very literary structure of these psalms. They're all molded around a series of questions. The psalmist asks questions of God. Verse 2 of 42. When will I come and appear before God? He asks in verse 9, why have you forgotten me? Why do I go mourning? He asks the same thought in verse 2 of Psalm 43. He asks questions of himself. Why are you cast down? He asks questions of his enemies. In verse 43 of 42, my tears have been my food day and night, while they continually say to me, where is your God? Verse 10 of the same chapter, my enemies reproach me while they say to me all day long, where is your God? There's this refrain of answers and questions and answers. Psalm 62 and verse 5 is another example of this. What do we read? My soul, speaking to himself, my soul, wait silently for God alone, for my expectations from him. People think that you're crazy if you talk to yourself. The Bible thinks you're actually very smart to talk to yourself. Listen to these words by Dr. Martin Lloyd-Jones, one of England's greatest expositors. He's got a phenomenal book entitled Spiritual Depression. Listen to these words. The main trouble in this matter of depression is that we allow ourselves to talk to us. with me. He has not forgotten me. He has not forsaken his people. Deuteronomy tells us we will be exiled for our disobedience, but as we turn back to God, he will turn us back home in his time and in his way. The best sermon you'll ever hear on how to overcome depression will be preached by yourself, to yourself. When I was in the RUC in Northern Ireland for a number of years, one of the training sessions we went to involved watching a video about gunshot wounds and how to deal with them should you be wounded on the battlefield. And they reminded us that there was evidence that in some cases, and I may have shared this with you before, that some officers here on duty were shot in places in their bodies that weren't life-threatening. Medically speaking, they should not have died. And they concluded that many of the officers panicked, didn't talk to themselves, allowed themselves to talk to them, and the first thought was, I'm shot, I'm going to die. And they began to shut down physically and emotionally. They didn't fight. They didn't stay alert. They didn't try to stay alive. And again, the power of the mind. We've got to talk to ourselves. We've got to remind ourselves of glorious truths. You've got to talk to yourself, interrupt yourself, and be willing to disagree with yourself. And don't be offended if somebody else does it with you. We've got a present examination. We've got a past education. Look at the next thing. He's talking to himself, and as he's talking to himself, he begins to dredge up from the bottom of his memory all those thoughts about God that will aid and help his faith. To offset the danger of following his feelings, the psalmist pursues God in the remembrance of actions past. The psalmist fights dejection with reflection. Write that down. I like all the one-liners. There is one. Fight dejection with reflection. Talk to yourself about yourself. Fight dejection with reflection. Look at verse 6 of Psalm 42. What do we read? Oh my God, my soul is cast down within me. Therefore, listen while I remember you. From the land of the Jordan, from the heights of Hermon, from the hill of Mizar. Got that same thought again in verse 2. When I remember these things, I pour out my soul within me. For I used to go up with the multitude. I went up with them to the house of God. And I've no doubt it seems clear to me. Perhaps he remembers songs that he sang, sermons that he heard, conversations that he had. He began to meditate upon God, God's goodness, God's faithfulness, God's chesed, covenant love for Israel. And he began to rise out of the sloth of this world. He took from the archives of his memory thoughts of God's mighty deeds, thoughts of God's wonderful triumphs. And you're going to find that again and again repeated throughout the Psalms. Look at Psalm 22, verses 4 through 5. What do we read? Our fathers trusted in you. They trusted in you, delivered them. They cried to you, were delivered. They trusted in you, were not ashamed. Implication being maybe that gives us hope. Look at Psalm 63, verses 5 through 6. Similar thought. My soul shall be satisfied as with marrow and fatness, and my soul praise you with joyful lips. How will he praise him? In what will he praise him? When I remember you on my bed and meditate on you in the night watches. You know, if you can't sleep, don't count sheep. Talk to the shepherd. And meditate on your bed upon God. And go back over the past. It's so easy to get clouded, isn't it? It's so easy to get fogged. Some of you men are in it with your business, and some of you families are in situations that are closing in, and they make us myopic. And we become very short-sighted, and our memories aren't very long. And yet, if you're a 50-year-old man, have you not got 50 years of memories to draw upon about God's goodness, God's providence, God's sovereignty, God's unerring love? Oh, my friend, I say this to myself. We've got to find a map for ourselves by drawing upon the memory of God's goodness and greatness when we have lost confidence in those things. One last verse in Psalm 77, verses 4 through 5. Again, similar thought. You hold my eyelids open. I am so troubled that I cannot speak. I have considered the days of old, the years of ancient times. I call to remembrance my song in the night. I meditate within my heart. My spirit makes diligent search. There needs to be a present examination. There needs to be a past Masters Romania. And he began to lose his ability to taste food. And then I went to visit him one day just to pray with him and see how he was doing. Whatever he had, it all tasted the same because he couldn't taste the thing. I remember talking to him, he says, Philip, I said, how you deal with that? And God in his goodness would bring his taste back. It was a temporary thing. But he said, you know what I do? I look at the food, and he says, and I try and remember what it used to taste like. Try to envision what salt tasted like, or sugar tasted like, or what meat tastes like in distinction from vegetables or potatoes. And he says, I can still enjoy my food in the memory of what it once tasted like. And I think the psalmist is saying that, when you lose your appetite, draw upon the memory. Taste and see that the Lord is good. And your taste will come back, and your appetite will come back. Last though, do they have a present examination and a past education? You have a future expectation. A future expectation. Isn't this lovely? Verse 5. Hope in God, for I will yet praise him for the help of his countenance. Verse 11, a similar thought. Hope in God, for I shall yet praise him, the help of my countenance and my God. Similar thought, verse 5, Psalm 43, hope in God, for I shall yet praise him, the help of my countenance and my God. Hope began to surface by faith.
Oh. 20, 40, 60, 80. Ugh.